Good evening, my friends. This is Paul, and today is the first episode of what I hope to be many of a new series where I'm going to gush about games that I absolutely love and hope that more people will give them a try if they have the means. And the game I decided to start the series off on was none other than Fire Emblem Path of Radiance. Mainly because, as far as my memory can tell, this was actually the very first RPG I ever played. When we first booted up Path of Radiance, my brother and I, we really didn't understand what we were getting into. The first battle took place, and we were mashing buttons on the controller, being like, okay, why does it seem like none of Ike's attacks are hitting the enemy? And we did terrible on our first ever playthrough. It was mainly my brother playing, and I was watching and just commentating and giving advice, and we were so bad that the main character, Ike, was like level 1 or level 2 by the time we got to the final battle, and we had to restart the entire game because we had never played the previous Fire Emblem games. I don't even think I had played Paper Mario at that time. We were just complete novices to the whole genre. But yet something about Path of Radiance must have clicked with us, because then we went back and we honed our skills, and eventually I started playing it, and now we've beaten Path of Radiance so many times we've lost track. And now both of my brothers are absolutely obsessed with the game's sequel, Radiant Dawn, and I think each of them have beaten it at least 16 times. They always insisted on playing it on easy mode because they wanted to level up the most characters. And I guess I just want to talk about why is it that that game caused us to do so terrible at it, but then want to get better. So first of all, the thing about Path of Radiance is that even though it was one of the later Fire Emblem games in the series, to us being the first, one of the things it had to really nail was, what do you do if this is someone's first Fire Emblem game? Quite simply, you strip it down to its absolute basics, and then you build up the player's knowledge over time so that they feel like a master by the end of the story. This works not only on a gameplay level, but it works really well with the story the game is trying to tell. The opening cutscene has the main character, Ike. Yes, this was his first appearance. Not in Smash Brothers, not in Fire Emblem Heroes. A tiny little GameCube game of 2005. Voiced by Jason Adkins, by the way. And Ike is getting absolutely destroyed by his father in a sword fighting duel. Thankfully, they're wooden swords, so they don't cause too much damage. And Ike gets so badly defeated that he ends up being knocked out, and his sister has to put a wet rag over his forehead to help him up. And so then he gets a chance to have a rematch against his father, and a bit of a mini rematch against his friend Boyd to get you into the mechanics of the game. And people who have played the Fire Emblem series before will tell you that this is a stupid easy battle, because it's pretty much just a glorified walk you through it tutorial. Like, if you've played Fire Emblem before, you're going to be like, okay, walk up to Boyd, attack, just keep doing that ad nauseum. And yeah, of course it's boring if you've played the series before, but for us, this was a really complicated system. We had to realize, okay, we are not in direct control of Ike. We have to move him on a grid and get to the next character, and then we have to get into the habit of selecting a weapon, and then we have to get into the habit of reading the combat forecast. And so of course we had to take it slow, because again, we didn't really know anything about RPGs. So the fact that it was revealed that Grail, Ike's father, was holding back on us was actually really refreshing, because we were like, oh, it's almost symbolic of how the series is holding back on us, because they realize that we don't know what we're doing. So the very first battle is in a village that bandits are raiding, and of course it's typically a Fire Emblem tradition that you always start out facing bandits and you work your way towards tougher enemies as the game goes along. And since Ike is such a newbie in the mercenary world, his friends are trying to teach him all these tricks about how to attack the enemies properly. And so this is where we get an introduction of the weapon triangle, which has been around in Fire Emblem for quite a while. But again, how do you take something iconic and present it to newbies? Nowadays, everyone knows, or at least everyone who's familiar with Fire Emblem knows that swords beat axes, axes beat lances and lances beat swords. But how do you explain that to the player in a way that's easy to remember? Quite simply, you build up a bond with the characters, and that way the characters themselves can represent the different weapons, and then you can associate their banter with the weapon triangle. To give you an example, remember Boyd? The one that I mentioned earlier where Grail said, "Hey Boyd, you and Ike are partners, how about you spar for a bit?" So you know already that Boyd uses an axe. You also know that Ike beats him pretty well. So then in this tutorial section where Boyd is once again your companion and he's joining you on this mission, Oscar says, "Remember, Ike, that your sword is advantageous against anyone who carries an axe." So Ike says, "Oh, that's easy to remember. I'll always have the advantage against you, Boyd." So this banter between the two of them that existed in the tutorial chapter is carried over to explain a gameplay mechanic. And I cannot think of a single other game that does that. Let me know in the comments if you can think of one, because I'm seriously struggling to think of that. And so just remembering, okay, what would Boyd be weak against has actually helped me to remember the weapon triangle even in future Fire Emblem games. And thankfully, all of the enemies in this tutorial level are either bandits or myrmidons, which means that they carry swords. So that means Ike himself, the main character, is never at a disadvantage. Additionally, for some reason, the game stocks Ike with 4 iron swords, whereas normal Fire Emblem heroes would start out with like 1. And this is a good way of teaching the player not only is this weapon system different from the previous game, but it also teaches the player that you can switch between different weapons. You don't have to just attack with whatever weapon you're given. So, if Boyd has different axes, he can switch between them. And so all of these little things in the tutorials just keep adding up so that every time you get to a new chapter, the story and the gameplay sort of melds together in a really interesting way that, again, I'm not really sure I've seen any other game do this. Now, I'm going to skip around a bit because this essay is going to take forever if I go through the whole game, and frankly, I don't have the editing expertise to put that together, but there are other examples too, like a thief will join your party, and he'll say, "Hey, if you pay me enough, I'll be able to break through all these locks." And the level where the thief shows up is in a prison. And so Ike's like, "Well, we have no other way of getting these cell doors open, so we might as well hire this thief." And you have the option to turn him down. And if you do turn him down, it is still possible to break the prisoners out, but then you have to break down the doors. But if you so choose to take up that thief, then you get an advantage in the level, and it teaches you a gameplay mechanic at the same time. There's also a mini stealth section in that level, so that was pretty cool. Then there's the Laguz characters, where you learn that Laguz are a new type of units that are humans, but also animals, but they can only be in animal form for so long because it tires them out. And admittedly, this might be something that Fire Emblem veterans will have to get used to. But the way that the game eases you into it is that the 2 Laguz units that first join your party join as partners. So this is another new thing to the Fire Emblem series. Normally you have green colored units, which are your allies, which move on their own. And sometimes they do really stupid things because the AI is so darn terrible. So they say, "Well, we are under your command, so you can tell us what to do." So yet again, a tutorial is shown of partner characters because you can actually give commands in the menu of where you want these characters to go. So then you get to experience sort of a demo of what they're capable of. You're like, "Oh, okay, these characters attack while they're in their animal form, but they can only stay in their animal form for so long, but if I don't want to use them yet, I can order them to stay back." So then you're getting in the hang of being a commander, and again, this works really well with the gameplay because Ike is the second in command to the Grail mercenaries, which means that if Grail dies, then Ike's going to take over the whole army. And at first, Ike's really reluctant. He's like, "No way, I'm no leader, I'm just a simple mercenary." But yet, as the game progresses, you see Ike get more and more confident, and then by the time you see him in Radiant Dawn, well, I won't say what happens to him in Radiant Dawn, but the progression that was given in Path of Radiance feels totally justified. And again, from my perspective and my brother's perspective, this gameplay loop of Ike being reluctant carried over to us because we were reluctant. We're like, what are these animal-like creatures? How are we supposed to control them? Ike must have been feeling the same way because they started out as allies before they actually joined your party. We're like, should we trust this thief? Do our decisions actually matter? But perhaps one of the most amazing examples of where the story and the gameplay come together so well is in the permadeath mechanic. Because we weren't used to there being involved stories in video games. Our prior experiences were Super Mario 64, Banjo-Kazooie, Ocarina of Time. I think we might have played Majora's Mask by then, but it was like those first three were our primary exposures to gaming stories. And so when we did terribly in the battle and the characters died, we thought, oh, the character will just come back, only to realize that character was gone forever. And this wasn't just a gameplay mechanic, as sometimes in the story, characters would die, and we'd think, oh, this is just like in all those kids' movies, where they're just knocked out. But no, the game actually shows you a gravestone and says, there are consequences to battles, and this isn't just a kids' game. And so by making that into a gameplay mechanic by if you stink, your characters are going to die, and you're never going to see them again. And one thing that this game does that I haven't seen any other Fire Emblem games do is that Ike actually acknowledges his companions at the end of every battle. So Ike has a tactician named Soren, and Soren's in charge of providing the strategies for each battle. So every time you go back to the base, Soren says, I'd like to report how the battle went, and you get stuff like who was the most important unit, how much gold did you get. But another thing Soren does is that he tells you how many companions have fallen. And the next thing you see from Ike, just him closing his eyes and there being an ellipsis, and Soren says, I'll let you grieve in peace. So that tiny little touch shows that Ike is feeling the same way as the player, that he recognizes each unit as an individual, as a friend. And there are even some dialogue choices too, like characters will, well, admittedly this is only early in the game, but like characters will say, oh, I miss Boyd so much, if for example you let Boyd die, and some cutscenes will change because of that. There are characters that might change allegiances, and it's possible to kill that character, when in reality it's also possible to make the character come back to your side. So that encourages you to hear their stories, and to treat them as individuals so that you might get an idea of what you need to do next. And this is all so much of a gameplay emphasis, but there's so much more to Path of Radiance than just it being a My First Fire Emblem. It also just has a really approachable battle system compared to what you would expect in most RPGs. When you go up to an enemy, you have what's called the combat forecast, which basically predicts how the battle is going to turn out. And there's only 4 things that you have to worry about. How much health do you have? What percentage do you have of hitting the enemy? How much damage you're going to do, and what percentage you have to do a critical attack. Now this may seem very complicated at first, but really you can only carry 4 weapons at a time, so there's really only 4 variables. Second, I think most people know percentages relatively well. So they could say, okay, this weapon has 80% chance of hitting, so that's pretty good odds, but let's see what this other weapon does, and see how that changes the combat forecast. And knowing that your enemies are going to be using the same metrics against you helps you feel like everything is balanced, and that you don't have an unfair advantage. Technically speaking, I can really only think of one level in the entire game that I dread replaying, and that's, well, I won't say what it is, but there's a level with a lot of birds, and it's not the one you're thinking of, it's the other one, much later in the game, that I'm just like, oh, this level stinks. But generally speaking, Path of Radiance is filled with nothing but amazing levels. And one thing that I think helps it stand strong so many years later is that the combat is kept, for the most part, relatively simple. Games later along the line, like Fire Emblem Engage and Fire Emblem Three Houses, tried to streamline things, but in the process, it ended up making things more complicated. Like, for instance, Three Houses added the opportunity to have like little mini armies follow along beside you, and then you could do a gambit where a bunch of units charge at another enemy. But that adds a couple of new things to keep in mind. When do you use this charge ability? Should I use it against this monster, which these monsters have 3 different health bars? And then these monsters also have defense boosts, where if you break the squares around them, then that cracks them, giving you an opportunity to do more damage if you hit them on this particular square. Man, if we had started out with 3 houses instead of Path of Radiance, I think I would have given up. But the fact that Path of Radiance really keeps it as simple as how much damage are you going to do and how much percentage you have really helps the game out a lot. And don't get me wrong, the game has its moments of slight complexity, like if you stand in a bush, you get more defense and slightly more dodge, but that's self-evident because in real life, if you're hiding in a bush, that's gonna make it harder for a weapon to hit you because the brambles might hit the weapon. Simply using common sense often will give you benefits because that's what you would have thought of to begin with. Now, I know that later Fire Emblem games have expanded on the character roster and made the characters have stuff like favorite foods and likes and dislikes, and that would like affect their stats in 3 houses. And while I personally prefer that game's cast to this one, there was a time where my brother and I could remember every single character, and we would sometimes act out their stories to each other in the backyard and to our neighbor because we were like, hey, we want to see these characters play out their lives. And when a lot of them returned in Radiant Dawn, we were like, oh, let's see how different they are or if they're still keeping the same old trademarks. And admittedly, a lot of them do boil down to, like, Boyd is the go-getter type, Shinon is the cold, emotionless one that just gets the job done for a paycheck, Gatry's the ladies' man. But yet at the same time, it's the interactions between the characters that makes them feel so much better than that. Ike and his sister Mist, for example, have a very believable sibling relationship. They very clearly care about each other, but yet they're not afraid to get on each other's nerves at the same time, and sometimes Ike will even make Mist embarrassed in front of strangers, and Mist will say, oh, Ike, why do you have to be such a meanie? And speaking of Ike, a lot of people say that he is the best Fire Emblem lord out of all of them, and I agree. But why do I agree? Mainly because Ike is, well, quite frankly, he's very different from a typical Fire Emblem lord, at least at the time, because he was not royalty, he was not a prince or a princess or anything like that, he was a mercenary. And he loved being a mercenary so much that it put him at odds with the other Fire Emblem lords in the series. When he does get a chance to speak to the royals, he doesn't really know what he's doing because mercenaries aren't taught common courtesy. And as someone who didn't have the best social skills growing up, I could relate to that. But I also found it kind of endearing because you would normally think, oh, Ike is just this rude guy, and how can that be considered one of the greatest lords ever? But that's not Ike's entire defining characteristic. You see plenty of other moments where Ike has, other traits. There are moments where he's quite hot-headed and tries to rush off to save his sister, even though his dad clearly told him, Ike, this is a trap, you need to think this through. Ike's like, I just gotta be loyal to my sister. There are times where questions about race and prejudice come up, and Ike is just like, say what? And everyone is so amazed at the fact that he just shows no prejudice between different races of people. And I think that's what keeps Path of Radiance as one of the best stories in the series, is because it doesn't try to do anything that's too within the realm of anime nonsense. It keeps things, as much as you can in a fantasy setting, pretty grounding. But that groundedness helps the story feel more grand and more epic, and then it makes Radiant Dawn seem like even more of a payoff, especially when apparently, if you look up this game's history, it was not developed with a sequel in mind. I don't know how much I buy that, because Radiant Dawn only came out 2 years later, and so that seems like a ridiculous amount of time to come up with an amazing follow-up that actually answers every single plot hole, but it worked out. And so with such a simple story, and such simple yet complex controls and gameplay mechanics, and the way that the narrative weaves its way into the tutorial, and the fact that the game has an absolutely glorious soundtrack, not quite up there with 3 Houses, but I think it is a bit more consistent. Like 3 Houses will occasionally switch genres on you, like you'll get dubstep for an entire chapter, whereas 3 Houses is just consistently that traditional orchestral feel. Whether it was performed by real instruments or not, I don't know, but it's definitely some of the best sound samples I've ever heard on the GameCube. And it's just an RPG that I think most people could easily pick up, and if they've already played Fire Emblem, they could see, wow, dang, for the series' first leap into 3D, it may not have revolutionized the gameplay, but it refined it by all these little steps that add up to make an amazing package. And all these years later, there are still things that Path of Radiance did in 2005 that modern Fire Emblems don't do. It kept the fan service to pretty much a minimal. Like, maybe the most you'd get of anime nonsense is like a woman might show a lot of skin on her legs. That's about it. The gameplay is so much more approachable because you're not dealing with all these other complex mechanics, like are the enemies going to target you, like with the targeting lines and engage, or the beasts and three houses, or worrying about the barracks or teaching the students or anything like that. The most complex thing this game tries to pull on you is making your own weapons, but that's such a simple process that people who clamor for this being Fire Emblem Cross WarioWare DIY might want to wait a bit longer. It's approachable, but yet at the same time, if you keep getting better, you can find more enjoyment out of it on later playthroughs. The support system is so much more in-depth. It may not be as streamlined as other games, but you feel like you have actual conversations with the characters, and there's actual nuance and depth to it. Now, is Path of Radiance perfect? No, it's a pretty ugly game. Like, it certainly wasn't pushing the boundaries of what the GameCube was possible, except in those cutscenes. They were phenomenal, but they had absolutely atrocious voice acting. Back then, Fire Emblem kind of just let whoever record the lines and didn't really care about it sounding too professional, so that is one thing I will give the later games. And the soundtracks weren't quite as bombastic. Yes, this game went for a more traditional orchestral style, but none of it was mind-blowing. It was kind of just like the expected next step of going from Game Boy Advance to GameCube, rather than sounding like something truly evolutionary like Fire Emblem Awakening did. Unfortunately, this game is quite expensive nowadays, and even if you can afford it, do have a working GameCube. But if you can get your hands on Path of Radiance, then you are in for an absolutely legendary story, and pretty amazing characters with good music, and easy to learn, hard to master gameplay, and I think it would be a great first entry in this beloved series. And by this point, Fire Emblem hadn't overstayed its welcome, so I think it'll be a good way of saying, you know what? The people that hate on Fire Emblem are probably the ones that started out on Awakening. They need to realize that the original formula nailed it so well, and all these years later, it's still a blast to return to the world of Tellius. So with that, thank you very much for watching, my friends. I hope if you get a chance to play Path of Radiance that you'll love it just as much as I did. Please let me know down in the comments, of the games I've reviewed, mind you, which games you would like me to cover in this series next. And until the next time, remember to keep the faith, stay epic, and God bless. Bye!